This is Meadow. That is 240 pounds of Cane Corso. Well, maybe not Meadow. She's some sort of mastiff mix. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, great companions, great pets. They really are. But in some parts of the world, that's 250 pounds of protein. Now, before you go and say, ew, because you're doing it, I know you're doing it, I do it, just think that last hamburger you had in some parts of the world, that's just as ew. Beef is quite a sacred animal. So then you have to ask yourself, why? And how did we get here? We we like to think that our modern diet, it's personal choice. This filming this out in the sun was a terrible idea. We you know we think that it's based on morality, health, civilized taste, but it's not. It's actually just cold hard math, a little bit of historical amnesia, and factory automation. So then you have to ask yourself, how did, I don't know, a group of primates go from smashing a bunch of leg bones with rocks to get into that marrow for fat to like a society that wraps their three specific animals into pristine plastic and styrofoam and calls them, it calls everything else basically a sin.
Walk into the meat aisle of a modern grocery store, and you are surrounded by a seemingly endless variety of standardized cuts. These pristine, plastic wrapped portions are presented as the default setting of the human diet. Yet, as recently as the late 1800s, American cookbooks looked like field guides. Dinners regularly featured roasted robins, terrapin stew, and boiled eels, foods that have almost entirely vanished from the modern household. Culinary boundaries shift even further across global history. In several regions, animals we strictly categorize as pets, such as dogs, have long standing roots as a source of protein. It is easy to assume our modern menu contracted because of a collective moral shift, or that our palates became more sophisticated as we modernized. In reality, the contents of our grocery carts are the result of structural filters, biological, legal, and industrial, that began narrowing our choices long before we ever pushed a cart. The first of these filters is the logistics of the food chain. It explains why we rely on slow grazing cattle rather than animals that reach maturity in a fraction of the time, like a dog. This is the 10% energy rule. Energy moving from plants to herbivores to carnivores loses 90%. Cattle act as bioconverters, transforming indigestible grass into protein. Predators lack this efficiency. Farming dogs means feeding 10 pounds of meat for 1 pound in return. This energy loss is compounded by biomagnification. Environmental toxins and parasites accumulate in higher concentrations the further up the food chain an animal sits, making predators a significantly riskier source of food than herbivores. Cattle also provided a continuous economic return beyond meat. They offered renewable dairy calories and supplied draft power, functioning as the engines of early agriculture. Early humans valued dogs for their utility as hunters and guards. Consuming them was generally a short-term survival choice, not a sustainable way to feed a population. Ultimately, farming predators for mass consumption isn't a viable option. The energy transfer from plant to animal simply cannot support it at scale. While biology defines what we can farm, legislation determines what we are allowed to keep on the menu. Robin pie vanished because of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Protecting these birds legally removed a common food source from the American supply chain. We see a similar legislative edit in Japan. The country's historical avoidance of meat eating was the direct result of a 7th century imperial ban, influenced by Buddhist teachings. By 1687, Tokugawa Tsuneyoshi, the dog shogun, enacted animal protection laws so severe they effectively ended the practice of eating meat in Japan for nearly 2 centuries. These legal shifts suggest that visceral disgust isn't always innate. Often, it is the downstream effect of a centuries-old code that made a specific food item illegal, eventually turning a dietary staple into a cultural taboo. The final filter is industrial speed. During the Gilded Age, demands of mass production eliminated any food that could not be processed at high volume. terrapin stew fell out of favor partly because of the labor involved. The manual process of boiling mud turtles and removing their shells and toenails was too slow to survive a factory speed quota. In contrast, slaughterhouses found a way to save calf's foot jelly. By industrializing the extraction of collagen, they rebranded a labor intensive dish into sanitized gelatin. A food's presence in the modern era is often a measure of how easily it can be processed and marketed by an assembly line. The modern diet represents the endpoint of a highly specific supply chain, constrained by biology, regulation, and corporate efficiency. We rarely question our current staples, like brightly colored cereals and fluorescent vitamin waters, interventions that would likely appear bizarre to previous generations. We are also in an era of molecular gastronomy, where natural ingredients are subjected to extreme chemical and physical transformations to create entirely new forms of food. History shows that our definition of normal is constantly being rewritten. A century from now, which of our standard supermarket items will our descendants view as an unthinkable taboo?
So, if this video's then oh, there you go. Thanks, Meds. If this video's convinced you that maybe our food rules are completely arbitrary, congratulations. You've just replaced one worldview with another. Basically, maybe it's just our lines are fake. Maybe we just can't function without drawing a line somewhere and saying that that's the way things are. We don't get to escape the architecture of constraint. We just get to choose which walls we want to stare at. And there's Willow, who thinks she's a cow. Hey, stop that.